The investigator shoved his hand into the reliquary and pulled out brittle cloth wrapped around a charred folio. He scraped ash from the binding and found a painted spiral that ended on a minuscule human figure crowding a black center. Suspicion lodged behind his teeth and pushed him to keep the folio open even as cold wind licked the temple stones. He did not close the folio. He did not speak first. The moon threw hard light across the painted void, and the ruin smelled of wet stone and old cordage. Within 3 breaths, the central problem sat between them. A theology that placed people at the margin of the cosmos and offered a ritual schedule written beside it. The investigator felt suspicion become a tool. Suspicion moved his hands, selected which fragments to save, and decided the next step. Mara, the investigator, voice low and exact, "Hold the folio here." Mara slid a gloved hand under the page and kept it steady. Her fingers trembled once and then stopped. "Keep the light steady," Mara replied. "Silas needs to see the marginalia." They set the relic on a flat stone at the temple doorway. The stone rim had fresh chisel marks left by the archivist's rope ladder. The ritual had been hidden, and someone had recently tried to prise it open. A smaller, immediate question arrived with the folio. Who reopened what had been sealed, and why now? They carried the folio down the hill to the monastery where Brother Keeper Jonah lived among locked shelves and rules written in iron ink. Jonah met them at the lower gate. His face was hard and his palms smelled of beeswax. "Show me," Jonah demanded. They placed the folio on the archive table and lit a stand of candles. Silas the antiquarian arrived before the second candle burned down, coat rumpled, hair damp with rain. Silas set a magnifying lens over the spiral and tracked the painted notation with a forefinger. "These ledger dates, Silas, match disappearances recorded in this ledger." Jonah's jaw tightened. He closed his hand over the folio like a man trying to stop air. "If this is what I think it is, Jonah, we bury it. We bury it and we bury the memory." Mara answered with a single steady line. "Burial leaves questions for others to dig up." The room gained a sharpness. The argument that followed pushed them toward an ethical fracture. Jonah wanted containment. Mara wanted records. Silas wanted patterns. The investigator listened and measured which voice carried consequence. We reconstruct only enough to test whether the right predicts or produces events." Jonah slammed the table with an open palm. "No, you do not perform this. You will not draw the thing back." Silas looked at the ledger and then at Jonah. "Jonah, the ledger is not rumor. Ledger shows names, dates, and the same marginal sigils." Mara added, "If we do nothing, the villages will suffer again while we hide. Records have consequences." The debate boiled into rapid dialogue. Jonah paced. Jonah pointed at the folio. Mara crossed her arms. Mara spoke 3 short lines about proving harm. Silas countered with ledger entries and a name. "Which name?" "The investigator." Silas tapped a penciled line. "A field worker called Arden. Disappeared the week after a copied leaf appeared in his town. A runner arrived then, so breathless that he had to grip the table to stay upright. He spoke in jerks. "Arden is gone," the runner said. "He vanished from the field last night." A scrap of paper with the spiral was nailed to his doorway. Jonah's mouth opened and closed. He looked at the investigator and said, "You must stop this." Doubt replaced suspicion along a narrow seam. The investigator felt doubt like cold water across his forearms. Doubt sharpened questions. Had their handling released something tangible? Had a copy actually been posted? He set the folio back on the table and watched the candle flame swallow and spit. They went next to Silas' study, where ledgers lined the walls and the air carried the waxy smell of old glue. Silas matched the folio's marginalia to ledger entries using a slip of old parchment as a pointer. "Here, Silas, see this entry for March. Same sigil." A household left town the next day. The head of house never spoke again. Mara took the ledger and read aloud a line about ritual dates. Her voice stayed even, but her fingers brushed the edge of the ink as if counting letters could steady blood. "We have a pattern, Mara, not proof yet, but a pattern." Pattern suggests practice. The investigator, practice suggests people used it to shape social order. They reconstructed the folio's missing segment on Silas' table using clipped fragments and marginal notes. The work required careful alignment of ink strokes, and a steady hand for gilded highlights. As they inked symbols into the blank margin, lights in the study guttered, and a thin geometric shimmer slid across the manuscript, as if reflected from metal. Silas froze, hand over the nib. Mara reached to steady the paper. The investigator tapped the table once in a rhythm he used when thinking. Fear arrived with the shimmer. Fear contracted the chest and made hands quick. The three of them felt fear as a physical tightening, not an idea. Mara's breath hitched as she kept the nib steady. Did you see that? Mara. Silas nodded but did not speak. Jonah arrived at the doorway, hair mussed by wind, and said, I warned you. The atmosphere turned to urgency. The village runner's news had already made the problem concrete. People were missing. The ledger matched dates. Now an experiment had produced a physical effect. They debated containment in small, urgent sentences. Jonah demanded destruction. Mara insisted on documentation. Silas argued for more evidence. The investigator proposed a controlled reconstruction. Perform the rite in sealed conditions and puncture the sequence if danger appeared. Mara and Silas agreed. Jonah refused. The council split along the line of preservation versus protection. If you go through with this, you will not have my blessing, Jonah. The investigator folded his hands on the table and said, Your blessing is not the measure. The measure is whether it works. They read the reconstructed sequence aloud and planned minute steps. They measured candles, marked positions, and agreed on a break signal. 3 sharp taps from the investigator. Silas prepared the vellum. Mara arranged the circle. Jonah stood near the door, unwilling to stay but unable to leave. At midnight they entered the vaulted chamber where the rite could be performed away from prying eyes. The chamber smelled of beeswax and damp mortar. Candles circled an altar of plain stone. The folio lay open on an iron stand. They chanted the transcribed lines, not in a single voice, but in measured, scholarly rhythm. Each line corresponded to an inked curve in the spiral. On the 3rd cycle, the painted spiral seemed to unfurl behind their lids with steady clarity. The vision arrived. A series of cosmic diagrams mounted over their sight, each panel rendering people as tiny sparks next to a widening black center. Panic rippled through the room. Mara's hands clenched the folio until the paper creased. Silas' knees hit the stone, and he could not speak. The investigator heard the 3 taps in his head and could not bring his hand to make them. Fear escalated into a new register. The fear turned into a task. Stop the ritual. The investigator forced himself to move, to breathe, to count. He knocked the table with his knuckles. He spoke a single sharp word and broke the rhythm. The room snapped like a snapped rope. Candles flared and then dimmed. Both Mara and Silas collapsed away from the altar and lay panting on the floor. They fled the chamber in a disorder of cloaks and lamp smoke. The folio had changed. Pages had shifted and new lines appeared in an unfamiliar hand. A small object rested on the altar. A child's carved toy the villagers had described as belonging to Arden's son. Silas picked up the toy and held it like evidence pulled from a crime scene. Jonah stood in the corridor when they burst out. He stared at the folio and then at the toy. You were warned. Jonah, you bring back what was meant to remain buried. Mara set the toy down on the table and said, It is real. It left a trace. The investigator felt a new motion within him. Doubt had arrived earlier. Now resolve pressed against doubt and turned it into an action. They sealed the chamber and carried the altered folio to the scriptorium for inspection. Silas recorded every change in his ledger with a steady hand. Mara photographed marginalia by candlelight and labeled each photograph. The investigator sat apart and held the folio open, watching the ink as if it might move again. They argued 2 more times that night. Jonah insisted on burning the folio. Mara refused. Silas proposed copying the new text for analysis. The dialogue grew sharp and fast. Jonah accused. Jonah named what would happen if they displayed the folio to villagers. Mara countered with evidence that secrecy had failed before. Silas, the investigator, write down the exact sequence we used. Silas obeyed. Outside, villagers murmured at the gate. A woman asked for news of Arden. A child pointed at the monastery windows and said, They took my father's toy. The investigator stepped out and spoke directly with the woman. He held the toy and described where they had found it. She put her fingers over the wood and said, "This is my son's. He left it here when he worked the field." He did not leave the toy. After that exchange, the stakes change. Evidence tied to a missing person made the theology no longer abstract. They set a guard on the scriptorium. Jonah stayed awake with a Bible and a lantern. Mara and Silas worked through lists of names. The investigator decided to follow the altered folio's marginal trail, not because of curiosity alone, but because the object on the altar linked their study to a living harm. Before dawn, the investigator returned to the ruined temple doorway alone. He spread the folio on the same flat stone and compared the new handwriting to earlier inks. He felt a shift in himself. Fear receded from an edge into a colorless urgency. That urgency made him calculate next moves with clear hands. He counted the ledger entries again and mapped them against known ritual dates. A mid-chapter revelation arrived like a snapped cord. A ledger note in Silas' hand contained a name Jonah had kept secret. It named a former brother who had organized a ritual decade before. This changed the pattern. The investigator had assumed the theology lived in villages and itinerant cults. The ledger linked it to institutional actors inside the monastery. He returned to Jonah with the ledger and held it between them like a cold blade. Jonah's voice became small. "Jonah, I did not know his name on ledger. I only remember the season." Mara leaned in and asked, "Jonah, did the monastery ever perform sanctioned purges?" Jonah's answer was a handful of sound. "We punished, yes, we kept peace. But not like this." This exchange forced a turn in the investigator's mind. The trajectory moved from external threat to internal betrayal. The institution that denied knowledge might also have practiced it. He watched Jonah closely and noted the small involuntary signs. Jonah's thumb grinding the table rim, Jonah's eyes avoiding ledger ink. That counting of signs replaced rumor with a concrete line of inquiry. They debated strategy in short, pointed sentences. Mara wanted transparency. Jonah wanted burial. Silas wanted to trace the ledger back to names and places. The investigator chose action. He would follow the folio's marginal trail to the next site listed in the ink. Mara would accompany him. Silas would prepare copies. Jonah refused to help. At dawn, the ruined doorway threw a thin band of pale light across the folio. The investigator folded the altered pages carefully and tucked them into his satchel. He hooked Mara's arm with a steady hand and said, "We leave now." Mara adjusted her scarf and looked toward the valley where a cart had been waiting. They stepped down the hill with measured pace and no illusions about safety. The chapter closed on a concrete, situational beat. Jonah stood at the monastery gate and called out, "If you value anything, return with proof." The investigator paused on the path, felt sunlight on his cheek, and answered, I will return with the ledger or I will not return at all." Then he walked on, folio pressed flat against his chest, and Mara followed with her satchel of photographs and Silas' careful copies arriving behind them. Emotion shifts tracked the narrative. Suspicion pushed the first choices. Doubt followed the runner's report and the shimmer at Silas's table. Fear rose in the chamber and then hardened into resolve after the relic appeared. Resolve drove the investigator to leave the monastery even as Jonah pleaded for concealment. The final image anchors the chapter. The investigator at a ruined threshold, the altered folio in a satchel, and a path leading toward the manuscript's next named place. He did not look back. A gloved fist closed over the folio and pulled. He turned, braced his left shoulder into the reading table, and kept his fingers wrapped around the brittle cloth as the manuscript strained toward the doorway. Suspicion drove the investigator to tighten his grip. That suspicion had been climbing since he first eased the charred folio from the reliquary 2 nights earlier. He had felt the paper's brittle snap under his thumb then and had told himself it was simply a damaged artifact. Now a masked acolyte was trying to steal it in front of the archive lamp, and the problem was no longer theoretical. The masked figure yanked again, let go, a voice hissed. The investigator barked, hands off the table, and shoved. Someone slammed into his back. A lamp teetered. The folio slid halfway free of the cloth, and the inked edge caught on the table lip. He heard the scrape of leather boots, the whisper of fabric. The physical struggle declared the central problem plainly. The folio was being pursued by living adherents, not merely studied by curious scholars. He had not expected a theft at the reading table. He had expected careful handling, debate, cataloguing. Instead, he found himself in a physical scuffle in a room designed to prevent violence. That mismatch tightened his jaw. The investigator had spent the prior evening peeling soot from the folio's binding and tracing a faint cosmology diagram across a burned page. Now the folio might leave his hands before he could read the rest. Archivist Lina was at the doorway before the acolyte could reach the threshold. Lina's hand seized the masked arm and twisted, "Drop it, Lina." Her voice cut through the scuffle with the authority of someone who had spent 20 years managing contested objects. The masked figure spat a curse and shoved back. The investigator used the space Lina created to gather the folio under his arm and pull it close to his chest. The acolyte's mask slipped enough for the investigator to see dark eyes and a jaw set with desperation. The acolyte struck the table edge with the flat of a hand. A paper fragment fluttered to the floor. Lina cuffed the acolyte's wrist, the sound of palms slapping against fabric harsh in the lamplight. "Who sent you?" Lina demanded. The acolyte did not answer. "Mara." The voice named the figure before the mask did. The name landed in the room like a new fact. The investigator registered the recognition in Lina's face. Trust breached. He had to act on that change. Lina hauled the acolyte into the antechamber and slammed the door. The investigator set the folio on the table, pressed the parchment flat with both hands, and said, "Tell me what you saw." He kept his voice low, measured, as if the book might listen. Lina's breath came short. "You shouldn't have brought it out," she said. She jabbed a finger at the folio. "We have other pieces. You stirred them. You know what happens when you handle those pages at night." Her accusation cut at him. He answered with an action instead of explanation. He opened the charred folio on the lamplit table and let the light fall across the ink. Their argument began in low tones and rose within a few lines. Marcellus entered while they spoke, hands empty and posture precise. "Marcellus." "Lina, you are late." As usual, Marcellus did not meet her eyes. He walked to the table, placed a gloved palm on the folio, and said, "I claim custody under the registry. The board will hear my petition." His voice was smooth. He smelled of ink and a patron's pipe. "Claiming isn't the same as protecting." The investigator replied, "You keep documents in vaults until patrons demand them. This text names a procedure, not a myth. It maps a binding that reduces human centrality. It does not belong in a catalogue." He kept his sentences short and precise. Lina's shoulders tightened. She moved to stand beside him. Marcellus smiled with only his mouth. "You want a ritual reconstruction. You will tell the world and hand the steps to every crooked scholar and patron with a grudge. I propose cataloging, restricted access, dissemination by committee. Contain it through bureaucracy." Marcellus folded his hands. "Dissemination by committee invites slow leaks. The investigator, a committee can be bribed. A publication can be pirated. The folio names a site and a rite that minimizes human presence. That is a map, Marcellus. A map needs a guard, not a library call number." He tapped the folio's margin where faint ink circled a constellation. Marcellus' response came as a sharply paced exchange. "You always prefer the dramatic solution. You always prefer the safe ledger. I prefer accountability. I prefer containment. You prefer spectacle. You prefer secrecy." The three men traded 6 short lines. The dialogue made their differences concrete. Method versus motive. Lina interrupted. "Enough. Both of you quiet. Look at this." She turned a page and held it to the lamp. The page Lina displayed had a diagram drawn in faded iron gall ink. It showed concentric rings annotated with angular measures and small glyphs set at precise arc minutes. The ring's center contained a dark circle of smudged soot. The investigator crouched to study the notation. "This marks an astronomical site," he said, "offsets and a binding phrase. The diagrams line up with an observatory ruin outside town, cracked dome, aligned stones." He pointed to a notation that matched a map fragment he had pressed in his pocket from the reliquary the night he pulled the folio. Lina touched the ink with the back of her finger and flinched as if the mark were hot. "This isn't a metaphoric map. It's a schedule." pre-dawn alignment, a rite that instructs removal of human centrality. Her voice contained a tight alarm. Her fingers tapped beneath the table. An external event arrived, a slip of paper, pushed under the archive door, slid across the stone and stopped at Lena's boot. The investigator snatched it up. On the paper was a single pencil sketch of the same concentric ring, annotated with a time. Pre-dawn. The note had no signature. They rewatching. Lina, you handled the folio, it shows. We have only hours. The sentence forced action. Suspicion hardened into urgency. The investigator stood, folded the folio into its protective cloth, and said, "We go to the observatory." Lina peered at him. "We do not go alone." He met her. Slow and deliberate, "We go now." That decision shifted the texture of his attention from academic curiosity to protective duty. They moved through the archive's narrow corridors. The investigator kept the folio close under his coat. The pages crinkled softly. He nothing. Lina checked a wall ledger and pocketed a set of iron keys. Her hands were steady, but the cadence of her step had changed. The investigator watched her. He noticed how she rubbed her thumb against the ledger's spine, an old habit. That small physical detail anchored his assessment. Lina feared the consequences and was preparing to act, not to argue. They crossed the city in pre-dawn gloom. The investigator had suggested a direct route. Lina insisted on moving through service alleys to avoid watchers. He accepted the detour. Halfway to the observatory, a second external event occurred. A man stepped from a doorway and blocked their path. He wore a long coat and kept his hands visible. The investigator recognized him as Marcellus' courier, a thin-faced man who had delivered parcels to the archive in prior months. "Marcellus sends his regrets," the courier said. He handed them a folded note. The investigator opened it. Inside, Marcellus proposed a meeting at the observatory at first light for mediated access. The courier's demeanor suggested a message delivered with a patron's calm. Lina read the note, crumpled it, and spat. "He negotiates with contracts while others try to enact the right. He sells time for a seat at a committee table." Her words landed like accusations against Marcellus' motives. The conversation shifted into a compact confrontation. When they arrived at the ruined observatory, the dome had lost tiles. Stars peered through ragged gaps. A circle of weathered stone instruments lay around a central aperture. The investigator set the folio on a sheltered stone and opened it. He and Lina bent over the diagram and traced the inked coordinates. The physical act of matching ink to instrument made the page dangerous. This was a map that functioned when the sky matched it. They worked quickly. Lina whispered measurements as the investigator translated angles into placements. Their actions were precise and performed in short bursts. Set the astrolabe, level the staff, notch the sight line. They were interrupted by a noise. A footfall behind the broken dome wall. The investigator spun and saw a cluster of figures moving in the shadow, their faces masked, instruments in hand. A voice called, "Hands off or we call the rite complete." The leader stepped forward, Marcellus. Marcellus had not come to bargain. He wore the same patron's coat, but his pockets held slips of charcoal and a folded page. He raised a gloved hand and said, "We will not fight over this before the alignment. Move aside, investigator." "Lina, you owe me the registry." Marcellus' tone was practiced negotiation, his jaw set differently now, as a facilitator who had crossed into facilitator of action. The conversation became an argument. "Marcellus, Lina, you set yourself between containment and ceremony. Why are you here with them?" Marcellus replied, "Because containment without contact means it will leak into rumor. Control begins with a witness." The investigator stepped closer. "You brought them instruments. You taught them the sight lines." Marcellus' smile thinned. "You always see a conspiracy." Marcellus snapped, "I see preservation. We let academies observe, we restrain access." The investigator countered, "You let patrons fund a rite that displaces humans. That is not preservation. It's activation." The back and forth escalated with short, cutting lines. Marcellus' words were measured. The investigator's replies were edged with impatience. Lina cut in. "Stop talking and show me the folio." Her voice demanded the book be brought forward and examined before anyone acted. A mini cliffhanger occurred then. Mara, the master Cullite who had first attacked at the table, stepped to Marcellus and handed him a small carved talisman. He received it with the absence of surprise in his movements. The talisman reminded the investigator of the reliquary cord and the small carved figure he'd seen when he first unwrapped the folio. This exchange reframed the confrontation. Marcellus was not merely a rival antiquarian, he was colluding. The revelation altered the paths of action. Lena lunged for the talisman as if to confiscate it. Mara snatched back and spat, "Hands off, Lena!" The investigator moved to block Lena and Marcellus shoved a hand across her path. A physical scuffle broke out at the dome's edge. The folio tumbled from the sheltered stone and the wind lifted a single page. The page fluttered toward the aperture and plunged into a thin shaft of dawn. Lena swore and lunged for the page. The investigator grabbed her arm. He twisted and pulled the folio free from the center stone and clamped it to his chest. The scuffle scattered instruments and threw the masked acolytes into motion. Someone shouted a binding phrase, an ink-smudged line of sound, and for a single instant the air before the aperture shimmered with a pattern of pale light. The investigator felt his stomach drop. His hands went cold. The small vision impressed itself into his sight. A sequence of lights aligning above the dome, a slow erasure of a human figure at the center of a larger starfield. He could not say whether it was a hallucination or a direct metaphysical consequence. He only knew his breathing had changed and his knees felt thin. Fear arrived then as a physical response. His fingers tightened on the folio, his throat constricted, and he swallowed hard. Lena's face had drained color. Her jaw clenched. The chanting stopped. Marcellus looked at the aperture as if he had expected a different result. Mara stepped back and mouthed a wordless prayer. The immediacy of the rite's impact sharpened their choices. They arrested the ceremony by force of will more than strength. Lena shoved a hand into the folio's cloth wrap, closed it, and held the book like an offering. "We will not let this happen here," she said. "We will remove it from the field." Marcellus sneered and said, "You will not remove what is lit by the sky. You cannot undo what the instruments have begun." The exchange turned into a bargaining fight. Words became actions that moved bodies and books. In the aftermath, as dawn bled through the broken dome, Marcellus and several acolytes slipped away through a side fissure. Mara did not run. She left a small carved talisman on the fallen stone where the folio had been and walked toward the town without looking back. The investigator picked up the talisman. It was carved from dark wood, worn smooth by handling, and threaded on a thin leather cord. Lina reached for it and then paused. She let him hold the object. They returned to the archive with the folio wrapped and the talisman tucked into the investigator's coat. The conversation that followed turned on one concrete choice: destroy the folio or preserve it for study. Lina argued for destruction with short, clipped sentences. "We burn it. The ritual cannot be allowed to have instructions. We cannot archive a manual for eliminating human centrality." The investigator hesitated. He had seen the vision. He had felt the book's power. But he also felt a duty to record what had occurred. He moved his thumb across the folio's charred edge and thought of the reliquary's cracked wood from the night he pulled the folio free. He remembered the brittle cloth and the charred smell of incense trapped in the pages. Those concrete memories weighed on him. Lina put both hands on the archive table. "Destroying a document is an action with consequences," she said. "We remove evidence. We erase the opportunity to understand and to prepare." Her voice held an exhausted calculus rather than moralizing. The investigator met her eyes. If we burn this, someone else may reconstruct the rite from the talisman and other scattered notes. If we keep it, we can study the instruments and prepare to guard the site." The exchange forced a decision. They settled into a plan that resolved the chapter's immediate conflict without pretending the threat was gone. Lena locked the folio in a reinforced case. She stamped the registry with a record of emergency containment and set 2 men to guard the antechamber. The investigator slipped the talisman into his pocket. He felt its hard edge against his thigh when he walked. That physical sensation anchored his resolve. He would not ignore the collusion between Marcellus and the acolytes. Marcellus had vanished. Mara had left the talisman. Lena sealed the case and turned the key twice. She handed the key to the investigator for safekeeping and said, "You carry responsibility now. Not because you wanted it, but because you brought the folio into the light." Her statement was a removal of bureaucracy into a concrete personal charge. The final action came sharply and concretely. The investigator closed the archive door behind them, set the key on the table, and pressed his palm over the folio's wrapped edge for a moment. He did not say a reflective sentence about destiny or continuation. Lena, where did the observatory's eastern quadrant point? Lena gave him coordinates and a single instruction. Find Marcellus' patron list. Start with the merchant at the harbor. The investigator pocketed the key, folded the talisman into his palm, and left the archive to follow the lead. The chapter ends on an immediate, physical beat. The investigator stepping out into the light, talisman warm in his grip, resolved to trace the vanished Marcellus to the harbor where patrons meet, while Lina watches the locked folio and the two guards take their posts. This is a chapter that resolves the immediate theft, stops the rite, and leaves a clear directive: follow Marcellus, woven into the final action. The folio remains contained but active. The talisman travels with the investigator, and the next step is a concrete pursuit rather than an abstract vow. Emotion roots suspicion. The investigator's suspicion appears early and shapes each choice. He tightened his grip during the theft, doubted committee solutions, and pushed for direct action. Emotion shifts occur repeatedly. Suspicion shifts to alarm when the folio is targeted. Alarm becomes fear during the partial right vision. Fear hardens into resolve when Lena secures the folio. Resolve becomes wary determination as Marcellus vanishes and the talisman is left behind. These shifts are shown through gestures, dialogue, and decisions: rubbing a ledger spine, tapping a table, clutching a talisman, locking a case, rather than through abstract statements. The narrative ties to the prior reliquary theft explicitly and extends that event. The folio taken from the reliquary has drawn active adherents. The investigator now carries the next concrete task: trace the vanished collaborator at the harbor and follow the patron list. He shoved past the carved lintel and collided with an acolyte who smelled of cold wax and iron. The star, chart disc, slid across scuffed stone and spun underfoot. Suspicion tightened his hands before he had time to consider words. The investigator reached, knocked an oil lamp, and the lamp's flame guttered across an inked section of the disc that showed the human locus as a tiny, annotated circle. The conclave froze and a silent acolyte stepped between him and the altar. "Who are you?" the acolyte demanded. The question landed like a wrapped stone. It forced a decision. Within 5 breaths the stakes were visible. The disc was the axis of the rite. The conclave's robes were stitched with constellational sigils. The investigator had his coat hooked on a low beam and his satchel scraped the flagstones. Suspicion drove him forward. He wanted translation, not blood. He remembered the reliquary and the charred folio he had recovered days earlier, the ragged pages that had whispered a phrase about a scheduled weakening. He had carried that folio in the same satchel and felt its brittle edge through canvas now. That memory sharpened his intent. He did not speak to explain. He acted. He seized the disc and shoved the silent acolyte aside. A council acolyte lunged. Hands collided with wood and brass. A high, metallic note rang when the disc hit the plinth. Archivist Cora snapped a hand toward the altar, and the conclave's murmured cadence wrested the room back into motion. "Stop him, Cora." And her voice contained neither pleading nor outrage, but a steady order. The investigator twisted the disc. The inked cosmology bent into a spiral of tiny glyphs. He ripped a corner where a folded margin bore a smudge that matched the folio's charred ink. They pulled him down a corridor, fingers on his coat, elbows in his ribs. The corridor smelled of lamp oil and cold stone. Mal blocked their passage with a rolled parchment tucked under one arm. He set the parchment on the reading table and unrolled it with flaking hands. The fragment of disc rattled on the table as the lamplight caught a gold ink that traced the scheduled weakening of the human locus. "This is not myth, Mal." His voice held the dry rasp of someone who speaks with dust on his tongue. The investigator demanded, "Translate it." Suspicion shifted. A slow current of fear threaded his voice now because the chart named a date. Archivist Cora leaned close to the lamplight and traced the gold lines with a fingertip. "It predicts a waning point," she said. Not looking at him, "it places human prominence on a cycle. It shows a mechanism to accelerate the fold." The investigator let the word mechanism land as if it were a physical thing. He remembered the folio's torn riddle about an instrument of the Tali and felt a fresh knot form behind his sternum. Who wrote this? Cora's jaw tightened. "We only have scraps. Mal has the rest." Mel tapped the parchment. "Until now." Mel rolled the damaged cosmology outward. The diagram was a broken circle, a map of alignments, keyed with small annotations. One annotation listed human gatherings, another listed relics and their influence on the locus. A notation near the outer ring bore the same smudge found on the disk. Mel pointed with a calloused finger. "When the alignments narrow, the human locus thins. When the rite completes, certain human marks fade." His calm voice conveyed facts, not panic. The investigator leaned until his palms scraped the table. Fear shifted into a pressing urgency. "If they finish a ritual tonight, what happens to those marks?" Mal's eyes did not leave the diagram. They erased the local signature. The record shows diminishing memory, failing lines of inheritance, small artifacts that stop functioning. Not everyone disappears. But relevance drains. A small, sharp sound interrupted them. A mechanism clicking beneath the altar. The silent acolyte had engineered a gearwork, a star-forged plinth shifting into place. Cora moved as if to check the fitting and did not pull back her hand. She had the brass reading glasses perched low on her nose and her fingers were steady as a scribe's. The investigator watched the movement. That steadiness curled into suspicion again, tighter than before. Because Cora's fingers paused over a seam in the plinth and her thumb brushed a carved glyph that matched the folio's marginalia. He reached for her sleeve. "Cora," he said, his voice dropped. For meaning more than accusation. Cora's face was composed. She met him, and the small line at the corner of her mouth hardened. She did not flinch when he gripped her sleeve. Then she did something he had not expected. With one practiced motion, she slid a folded strip from her sleeve and slipped it into the plinth's seam. The strip whispered contact and the plinth shuddered. Cora met his eyes. "It must be enacted," she said. The word betrayal rose in his throat. Suspicion snapped into betrayal in a single breath. "Cora," the investigator. He gripped her wrist and the satchel bumped Mal's parchment. "You swore to preserve texts. You swore to transcribe." He tightened his jaw. Cora's fingers did not tremble. She replied, "I promised to preserve truth, not to preserve a species' arrogance." Her tone carried conviction. He wrenched his hand back and the plinth's gear clicked deeper. The silent acolyte moved toward a lever. The ritual cadence gathered speed. Mal grabbed for the lever. "Stop her, Mal," the investigator. Mal hesitated, then shoved his palm down on the gear. He had thought himself a scholar, not a warrior, but his arms locked like temple iron. The gear whined and gave. Metal scraped. Sparks lipped where brass met stone. A council acolyte shoved a stool into the line of the motion and the stool shattered. Acolytes shouted names. The cadence became a shout. The scene collapsed into hands and impact. The investigator lunged for the star, chart disc. He held it above the plinth and felt the parchment of the folio in his satchel against his thigh. Cora moved suddenly and tried to wrench the disc from his grip. Their palms collided over the inked surface. He smelled her scent, cold book glue, a faint tang of metallic salt, and he felt the small ridges of a scar on her wrist beneath the sleeve. "Cora, stop," she answered. "This will finish the Tali." Their voices were short, staccato. 10 rapid exchanges of command and denial followed as acolytes closed in. The room became a contained machine of intention. He could have destroyed the disc. It would have erased the only complete copy of the ritual drawn in that particular dialect. He thought of the charred folio he had recovered earlier, that folio he had dragged from a reliquary in another ruin. That folio had given him words but not the whole map. Destroying the disc would deny the cult the instrument they needed. It would also erase the last connector. He had to understand how the rite functioned. He wrenched at the chart and the disc gouged the table. His hands were raw. The choice tightened around him. Preserve knowledge or prevent the right. His suspicion had become fear and then a blunt, iron resolve. The crowd closed and 2 council acolytes reached for his coat. Male shoved them back. No more talk, Male. He looked at Cora. Cora, what are you trying to do? Cora inhaled and answered in a low voice, to correct a cosmic error, to end the pretense that human priority is permanent. The investigator's jaw clenched. He found his voice flat and precise. Cora, if you enact this, you erase families. You erase craft lines. You erase a child's toy. You erase the proof people leave behind. Cora's eyes slid past him, toward a small crack in the dome where thin starlight leaked. Is that not mercy? She asked. The argument tightened into a physical moment. Cora's hand flashed toward the plinth. The silent acolyte lunged to intercept. The investigator shoved Cora instead. She staggered. The folded strip slid deeper into the seam, and a tiny glyph glowed with an ashen light. The dome above them hummed once, like metal settling. A cold wash flowed down from the crack. The light painted the folio's edges in a thin blue. Mel grabbed for the glowing glyph with both hands. Stop this, he said. His voice trembled. That tremor shifted trust into despair. His confidence in scholarly restraint broke into an immediate attempt to physically halt the mechanism. Acolytes pressed their palms to the table and forced their weight onto the gear. The plinth began to rotate. The disc shimmered and a series of etched runes around its rim aligned with the dome's leak. Starlight pooled like mercury on stone. The investigator could feel hair stand on his forearms. He moved toward the plinth, and they met in a tide of bodies. Cora dug her heels in and looked at him with the raw steadiness of someone who has chosen a cause over a person. We have no right to keep clinging, she said to him. He grabbed her collar instead and said, You have the right to choose, but not alone. Their voices snapped like wire in the room. The climax arrived when Cora shoved a palm to the plinth, and the encoded glyph released with a needled click. The dome fractured along the old seam and cold starlight poured through. The light did not burn. It bleached pigment, leached warmth, and made the air feel thin. A child's wooden toy set on an alcove shelf shivered, and a painted eye lost its color. 2 acolytes screamed as the starlight touched their skin. Their voices were animal and quick. The folio in the investigator satchel flared at an edge and a sheet curled with a faint crackle. The investigator wrestled with Cora at the plinth and saw, in the lamplight, the exact place where the disc aligned with a note on Mel's parchment. He had to act. He chose to pull the disc free. He wrenched it up and away. The plinth shuddered and a hairline fracture split the disc. Inked lines separated and a small fragment tore free and slid into his palm. The larger disc spun and struck the dome. The dome's fracture widened and a column of starlight lipped like a blade. It washed across an altar and bleached the surface of a bronze relic until a tiny inlaid gem cracked and fell mute. Acolytes staggered. Cora hit the floor and the folded strip she had placed disintegrated in her hand like ash. She looked at him with a single, clear accusation. You broke the chart. He measured the loss in a dry, immediate way. The disc's fragment fit against the folio's smudge. The fragment contained the single annotation that linked the instrument to a local cluster of marks. He had the fragment and Mal had the rest of the parchment. Together they could reconstruct some of the right. He could not rebuild the whole disc. The choice to break it had been violent, but it left a tiny, valuable piece. Outside their immediate space the dome cracked, and the observatory's stones trembled. The silent acolyte staggered, clutching at his chest where the starlight had kissed skin. The investigator shouted, "Move!" And the room turned to flight. The altar ruptured. Cold starlight washed over a child's simple toy on the alcove, and the toy's painted face lost color. The investigator seized the scorched fragment with hands that tasted of metal and ash. He ran through collapsing rafters and down a stair that dropped into the observatory's stair. A stone gave and a council member fell, screaming and swearing. Mal caught him and pulled him up. The investigator did not look back more than twice. He ran with a fragment folded against his chest. Suspicion had mutated through betrayal and fear into a battered, focused resolve. They reached the rooftop as beams cracked and dust rained. Mal leaned against a broken balustrade, his fingers sore from gripping parchment. He breathed sharp, controlling breaths, and watched the ruin dumb. You destroyed the nexus." He was not accusing the investigator alone. He was stating reality. The investigator shrugged dust from his coat and set the fragment on the balustrade. The pre-dawn sky was thin as old paper. The fragment lay against the stone like a small coin. The investigator, "I saved a part." His voice was narrow. Mal's mouth formed a thin line. Mal's shoulders slumped into decision. "If you publish this, the city will unravel when they see the mechanism. If you hide it, more will try to finish what Cora started." His hands were steady, and in his steadiness the investigator read a refusal to be led by theory alone. "What do you want?" "Mal." The investigator watched him and felt the urge to lay out consequences. Instead he said, "We delay, we study. We keep the fragment and the folio apart until we can understand the sequence without triggering another activation." Mal closed his eyes and then nodded. The decision settled like tool steel into a plan, and fear cooled to a working clarity. Cora did not come to the roof. The investigator had seen her watch them from the altar when he fled. Her betrayal had been a choice and not a momentary lapse. He had expected hatred, but when he thought of her hands and the way she had slid the strip, he also saw a scholar's certainty. He had once sat with her over damaged ledgers. He had heard her read aloud dry footnotes at midnight. Now she had enacted a doctrine she considered necessary. The investigator felt a cramped sorrow. That sorrow moved his hands. He wrapped the disc fragment in oily cloth and slid it into a pocket within his satchel. He set the charred folio on top and buckled the satchel closed. That clasp felt like a temporary lid over events. Days later, in a small, empty hearthroom in a nearby village, the investigator sat with Mail and a burned, hastily bound copy of the parchment. They had lashed the fragment into a lead, lined box to mute the residual resonance. A child's abandoned toy lay on a low table, a wooden horse with a wheel missing. The investigator set the lead, lined box into a stack of books and placed the wooden horse on top of the stack. He had decided to bury the fragment where access would be slow and research would be deliberate. Mel stood and ran his hand down the spine of a book, as if checking that the stack could hold the secret. They argued in short, sharp sentences over whether to publish any warning. The investigator, "If the city panics, people will burn what they do not understand," Mail answered. "If we do nothing, others will try to finish the work, the back, and..." Fourth lasted 3 cycles, and then Mail broke with a practical move. He gathered 2 forged pages and slipped them into the folio to mark the sequence they had reconstructed so far. Their dialogue contained worry and calculation, but no theatricality. The room smelled of wet wood and old ink. The investigator's hands trembled only once when he set the lead, lined box into the hollow beneath a stack of books and slid a small stone on top. On the 3rd morning after the observatory's collapse, the investigator left the stack closed and walked through the village. He passed a child's empty bed and then paused where the toy had sat. Its missing wheel showed naked dowel. He lifted it. The horse's paint was worn in the exact pattern of a thumb on its flank. He thought of Mail's words about small artifacts losing function. He held the horse and tested the wheel's axle with an expert, quick finger. The wheel did not catch. His breath went short. He set the horse down and pressed his palm flat over the lead, lined box beneath the books. He allowed to no one, not yet, that single, concrete decision replaced 1,000 abstract arguments. Cora vanished into the ruined passages beneath the hill. Rumor carried her name and a few fragments of language. Correction, mercy, cosmic accounting. Some called her traitor, others called her prophet. The investigator did not chase the labels. He recorded what he could, transcribed Mail's notes, and taught a small circle of trusted scribes how to examine the lead, lined box without releasing its resonance. They practiced with the child's toy on the table as a test object. The toy's painted eye remained dull. Each visit they checked it and recorded nothing dramatic. The toy behaved like a toy. Still, the investigator kept the lead, lined box in the stack, and tightened the knot on its leather strap each night. The small shock came unexpectedly. A messenger arrived with a burned scrap of parchment from a distant shrine. The scrap described a ritual with a broken disc and a missing glyph and named Cora in a dry, bureaucratic voice. The investigator and Mal read it at the table. The scrap changed the pattern of what they knew. It implied that Cora had not been alone in her belief. It introduced the twist. Cora's action was part of a network, not a solo conviction. That revelation altered their priorities. They had assumed Cora acted alone. Now they had reason to believe other rites might be underway. Their conversation shortened into immediate tasks. They catalogued the folio and the fragment and folded maps into sealed wraps. At the end, the investigator did what he had to do. He carried the lead, lined box to a small, stone tome of books in the village library. The tome was an old crate sunk between volumes of local records and tax rolls. He pressed the box into the hollow and stacked the books back in exact order. Mel watched and set his hand on the crate as if to seal it. Then the investigator placed the child's wooden horse on top of the books, off-center so any casual hand would see it and not the box beneath. He closed the crate lid and hammered a single nail. He felt the nail sink through wood and the vibration travel up his arm in a solid, mechanical way. He left the library by the side door. A woman pushing a cart bumped into him and muttered apologies. He walked to the lane and paused, listening for anything that would indicate the ritual's echo. Nothing happened. The child's toy beneath a crate did not glow. The fragment in the lead-lined box did not call. He took a breath that tasted of stone, dust, and cold ink. He had made a decision that would buy time. It was concrete and physical. A nailed lid, a child's toy as a blind, a promise between two scholars to keep a secret for measured study. He did not write the final line in a notebook or speak a proclamation. He tightened the satchel strap and walked away. A small, distant star winked above the village. The sky was thin with the approaching dawn. The investigator went toward the road and toward the work of slow reading. Behind him, under a stack of books, the lead-lined box rested beneath a wooden horse, silent and waiting for whoever would come to lift it.